Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 462. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news on today's show, including Saudi war crimes in Yemen, so be sure to share today's show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute, reprinted on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. It's up anywhere you can listen to podcasts. And follow me on Twitter at KyleAnzalone_. In the past month, I've created a Facebook account again after getting banned. So if you are on Facebook, you want to interact with the show, with my work that way, or, send me a message or something like that, go ahead and add me on Facebook. If we don't have any mutual friends, just go ahead and send me a DM saying that you like the show or something like that. Just trying to keep the bots off of my account. And then on Instagram, it's Kyle Anzalone 3. And please, just give me a follow. And if you see any of my work in your feed, like it and put it out there to as many people as you can. Always appreciate when I see my listeners or, readers sharing my work. It really does help to get it out there to new people, and that's really the goal, get as many people informed as possible so we could change some of these absolutely insane policies. So let's get into the news today. First up from Dave DeCamp, Netherlands, Denmark pledged to provide Ukraine with F-16s. On Sunday, Denmark and the Netherlands became the first countries to pledge they will provide Ukraine with U.S.-made F-16 fighter jets following a formal U.S. approval of the transfer. The Danish Prime Minister said Denmark will hopefully provide Ukraine with 19 jets over the next few years, with the final deliveries being made in 2025. The Dutch Prime Minister noted that the Netherlands has 42 F-16s, but did not specify how many will be headed to Ukraine. Today, we can announce that the Netherlands and Denmark commit to transfer the F-16s to Ukraine and the Ukrainian Air Force, including cooperation with the United States and other partners once the conditions for such a transfer have been met. Zelensky was in Denmark on Monday and thanked the nation's parliament for the future delivery of F-16s. Secretary of State Antony Blinken provided the formal approval for the transfer in a letter to the Netherlands and Denmark last week. The letter said the F-16s can be sent to Ukraine once the first Ukrainian pilots have completed their training, which isn't expected to happen until next summer. The first batch of Ukrainian pilots have started training, which involves 4 months of English classes and 6 months of combat training. According to the Washington Post, the first class will only consist of 6 Ukrainian pilots. And so this is a real issue that it doesn't seem like many of the F-16s will be hitting the battlefield until the second half of 2024 at the earliest now, and that's at the earliest. It's only going to be 6 pilots. Who knows if that's even going to be enough to really carry out operations with the F-16s. And this seems like just another way to keep the Ukrainians fighting and committed to the military solution, even though they are having massive struggles right now on the battlefield. And let's move into that. We'll get to the cluster bombs next. Here we go. U.S. officials criticize Ukraine's tactics, say troops are spread out. So when I read this yesterday, it seems pretty infuriating. I think if I were, one of the Ukrainian government officials, I'd be pretty upset with my American partners over this. So, U.S. and Western officials, speaking to the New York Times, blamed Ukraine's struggling counteroffensive on Kiev's tactics, saying Ukrainian troops are too spread out. U.S. officials said that Ukraine's primary goal was to sever Russia's land bridge to Crimea, but that Ukraine has placed its troops and firepower equally along the entire front, in the south and in the east. The report, published on Tuesday, is the latest example of the West trying to pin blame for Ukraine's failures solely on Kiev, even though it was clear that the U.S. and NATO did not believe Ukraine would have much success, but pushed for the counteroffensive anyways. The Wall Street Journal reported last month that Western officials did not think Ukraine had enough training or equipment for the assault, but hope they will be able to break through. And so I think that's, a lot of where the frustration comes from me, is that this is just a lie. This is spin that's being put in the American mainstream narrative to try to blame somebody other than the White House for the disastrous situation in Ukraine. So the Times report said that the results of the Ukrainian tactics are more Ukrainian troops near Bakhmut and other eastern cities than in the south near Melitopol and Zaporizhia. The report said the U.S. has advised Ukraine to focus on pushing towards Melitopol. And so one of the problems that I have here is just, I'm sure the Russians read the New York Times, and so they know that this is what the U.S. is pushing the Ukrainians to do. My guess, or at least I guess I hope, is that before the White House allowed this official leak to be made, that they informed the Ukrainians, or they were aware that the Russians were aware of the goal, and they've been talking about that the whole time, that they wanted to go south and open up this southern front. So it's kind of, I don't know, I guess absurd to think that it would be successful just because the enemy knew the game plan from the start. But here, your advertising in the New York Times also seems odd strategy, again, unless the goal here is just spin within the American political narrative to make sure that they don't, the White House doesn't get too much blame for what's going on here. So the report said that Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, and other top NATO leaders told the Ukrainian commander-in-chief in an August 10th meeting that his forces should focus on one area. Two officials said that the Ukrainian commander-in-chief agreed with the Western advice. One U.S. official said that only with a change in tactics and dramatic move from Ukraine can the tempo of the counteroffensive change. And this seems to be crazy to me too, where we've already admitted that the counteroffensive didn't have a chance of success. It was just going to be the Ukrainian gusto, their courage, just the undying willingness of the Ukrainian conscripts who have been, pulled off the streets and forced onto the front of the battlefield, were somehow going to overcome their lack of training, their lack of weapons, entrenched Russian defenses that knew where they were coming, and that they were going to overcome all of that and have a successful counteroffensive. Washington is still pushing them to do that, even though Russia knows where it's coming from, and they haven't made any progress so far and have already sustained substantial losses. This is nuts. And I mean, we've also had stories in recent days about the Ukrainians becoming too casualty averse. And I think at least you have to say that, Kiev may have some concerns about, if you move all of your troops to the south, that Russia, could start moving in from the east or something like that and create different problems for Ukraine. So this story was infuriating when I read it yesterday. I think it does add to the point that I have been making quite often, but in my op-ed that I wrote last week and that we discussed on the show, I think on Sunday probably, or Friday, and that is that the U.S. policy here is really just to keep the Ukrainians feeding the meat grinder, because they know that will lead to Russia being weakened. And look, I guess from the White House's perspective, even if they're losing 2, 3, 4 Ukrainians to every one Russian, well, at least there are probably 50,000 dead Russians and at least 100,000 wounded Russians or more. Thousands or hundreds of Russian tanks destroyed. They probably deployed thousands of drones, and I'm sure this has been a massive expense for Russia. And so I'm sure the U.S. thinks that this is somehow good for them. All right, let's move on here. Officials suggest Ukraine is not tracking where it's using U.S. cluster bombs. A Ukrainian military official suggested to the Washington Post that the Ukrainian forces are not documenting where they are using U.S.-provided cluster bombs in Ukraine, despite assurances from the Biden administration that it said it received. The official, who only went by one name, detailed Ukraine's use of cluster bombs, which scatter small submunitions over large areas and are extremely hazardous to civilians. And so we've talked about cluster bombs in the past, but imagine you got like a big, bomb that's a couple feet long or something like that, and then inside of that there's all these little golf ball, baseball, maybe softball sized, but I think these are mostly baseball sized submunitions, are what they call bomblets. And then that bomb is supposed to explode some feet in the air and scatter all these little cluster bombs, all these little bomblets over an area. Now, they say that these cluster bombs only have a 1% dud rate, but apparently that is at least 14%, but as high as 25%. And so if I think it's 72 bomblets are in each one of these cluster bombs, if we're talking about, a quarter or so of those not working, man, I can't do that math in my head, but I bet it's about between 12 and 24, just kind of estimating there. And so that seems like a lot of little bomblets laying around. Now, part of the idea that the US had was they would track where all these went, and then they could, at the end of the war, I guess, go through and clean up these specific areas for cluster bombs, and probably make the cleanup a little bit cheaper, but it doesn't seem like that's happening. Now, I also thought the U.S. sending cluster bombs to Ukraine, and Ukraine primarily using them in their counteroffensive, has been maybe a little bit telling too, in that maybe Ukraine doesn't think they're going to take this territory back, and figures that just slathering Russian territory in bomblets is going to be a problem for Moscow down the line and not Ukraine. And so they're less hesitant to use these things, not thinking that they're really going to ever have to deal with the consequences of them themselves. All right, let's move on to this one. Russia says it destroyed boat carrying Ukrainian assault team in the Black Sea. The Russian Defense Ministry said on Tuesday that it destroyed a U.S.-made military boat carrying a Ukrainian assault team near Snake Island in the northern Black Sea. The ministry identified the boat as a Sea Force, a patrol boat made by Willard Marine, an American company based in California. Earlier on Tuesday, Russia said it destroyed a Ukrainian sea drone that approached a Russian gas facility in the Black Sea. And so, just interesting notes that Russia says they're destroying American-made equipment here. We have another Ukrainian attack on Moscow. Ukrainian drone disrupts Moscow airport traffic for second day. Airports in Moscow temporarily halted service for a second day in a row on Tuesday as Ukrainian drones again targeted the region, part of Kiev's strategy of bringing the war to Russian citizens. The governor of Moscow said the two drones were intercepted in the region and fell outside of the capital city of Moscow. He said one of the drones fell in the city of Krasnogorsk and damaged an apartment building and nearby cars, but no casualties were reported. The shockwave shattered windows in an apartment block and damaged cars. There were no injuries along residents, and no fire followed. TASS reported that 2 Moscow airports restricted service temporarily, and 9 flights were redirected to alternative airports as a result. A day earlier, about 50 flights were redirected from Moscow airports due to drone attacks. When Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow began to ramp up early this summer, Zelensky said the war was gradually returning to Russia's territory, to its symbolic centers and military bases. A spokesperson for the Ukrainian Air Force said the purpose of the drone attacks on Moscow is to impact those who feel the war is distant. The comments broke from Ukraine's previous policy of ambiguity on attacks inside of Russian territory. And at one point, it was a really important thing to the White House that we weren't carrying out attacks inside of Russia, but the White House just no longer seems concerned about that whatsoever. All right. So next up here, Polish president says Russian nukes in Belarus change security architecture. The Polish president, that's Duda, said Tuesday that Russia has been moving its nuclear weapons into Belarus and that the deployment changes the security architecture of the region. And so this is something that's happened, and in some extent, he's right. Another country in Europe now has nuclear weapons based in it. That changes the dynamics of Europe. However, Russia made very similar comments when they moved their nuclear weapons into Belarus, and it was because the NATO bloc had, expanded in different ways, had carried out different acts in Eastern Europe, including attempting a coup in Belarus. And so I think that probably has quite a bit to do with why Russia moved their tactical nuclear weapons to the country. Was, the U.S. really tried a color-coded revolution in that country a couple years ago. I think probably another reason, one of the cited reasons from Moscow, was the UK sending the depleted uranium rounds and the Challenger tanks to Ukraine. And so, they're putting nuclear material onto the Ukrainian battlefield. And then additionally, just how the security structure of Europe has changed, not only with NATO expansion, which of course is, problematic in the eyes of Moscow, but all that comes with that. We're talking about, and I wrote an article about the U.S. signing a new defense cooperation agreement with Finland recently, and how the U.S. is going to deploy more assets, more military assets for a longer period of time, more war games in Finland. And this is a country that shares an 800-mile long border with Russia. And so, what needs to happen is all these leaders need to get together, and they need to start a process of de-escalation, right? So starting to undo and unravel all these new steps that have been taken over the past couple of years. However, it seems much more likely that we're locked into this round of escalation where one side, mainly NATO first, carries out some sort of provocations, and then the Russian response is provocative in itself, but then leads to another round of Western provocations. And of course, the West never really takes into account that their initial provocations really kicked off the heightened tensions that we're dealing with. All right, Biden admin approves massive helicopter sale to Poland. Warsaw plans to buy nearly 100 Apache attack helicopters manufactured by Boeing for $12 billion. Until Poland receives the helicopters, the U.S. will provide Apaches to its NATO ally. The Defense Security Cooperation Agency, DSCA, announced the State Department greenlit the massive arms sale on Monday. The deal is for 96 AH-64E Apache attack helicopters, spare parts, thousands of missiles, including different forms too. They have surface-to-air missiles, they have Hellfire missiles, all kinds of different helicopter launch missiles, and then as well as maintenance and training for the helicopters. The State Department claims that the sale will further the security of the U.S., and this is from the press release. The proposed sale will support the foreign policy goals and the national security objectives of the United States by improving the security of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization ally that is a force for political stability and economic progress in Europe. Which is just an outright propaganda claim to make, because the White House has been complaining about the Polish repression of particularly their gay community, and then even criticism of their freedom of the press, and said the country was actually moving away towards democracy. So I'm sure saying them 100 attack helicopters will accelerate their progress towards democracy, not away from it. Further, the State Department said the proposed sale will improve Poland's capability to meet its current and future threats by providing a credible force that is capable of deterring adversaries and participating in NATO operations. And look, we don't need to sell Poland 100 attack helicopters to do that. Poland is under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. That's what protects Poland. So the reason this could be problematic is Poland is amid a military buildup with its neighbor Belarus. Minsk has increasingly sought closer ties with Moscow and now hosts Russian tactical nuclear weapons. Any conflict between Poland and Belarus would likely cause a nuclear holocaust perpetrated by the White House and the Kremlin. Warsaw says that until it's ready to field its own Apaches, Washington will deploy attack helicopters to Poland. The Polish defense minister said until the procedures are completed and the purchased helicopters are delivered to Poland, the U.S. Army will provide us with Apache helicopters from its own resources. All right, next up here, Australia's biggest warship drills with the Philippines in the South China Sea. On Monday, Australia's biggest warship participated in drills with the Philippines and the U.S. in the disputed South China Sea as a part of the first ever bilateral amphibious exercises between the Philippines and Australia. The exercises are called Alon. They kicked up on August 14th and will be held until the 31st as a part of Australia's annual Indo-Pacific endeavor, which involves Australia's armed forces visiting other countries in the region. The Australian Defence Minister is traveling to the Philippines to observe some of the exercises. Exercise Alon involves more than 250 personnel, including about 1,200 from Australia, 1,200 from the Philippines, and 150 U.S. Marines stationed in Darwin, Australia. The U.S. has been encouraging its allies in the region to increase military cooperation as a part of its strategy against China. The HMAS, so I guess it's Her Majesty's Australian ship, the Canberra, Australia's largest warship, was one of several vessels that took part in the exercises in the South China Sea on Monday off the coast of the western Philippines. According to AFP, the ships were involved in air assault drills about 125 miles from the Spratly Islands, where the Second Thomas Shoal is located, a reef that has been the source of recent tensions between China and the Philippines. Chinese Coast Guard vessels recently blocked Philippines' boat from resupplying a ship that the Philippines grounded on the Second Thomas Shoal in 1999 to assert its claim to the reef. After the incident, the U.S. reaffirmed that the Philippines and U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty applies to attacks on Philippines vessels in the South China Sea, demonstrating how the region has turned into a potential flashpoint for a major conflict. And so we have spent a lot of time talking about particularly Taiwan and how that is, I think, the greatest potential flashpoint between the U.S. and China. However, the South China Sea could provide a problem too. Now, maybe rallying the American people to be motivated to go to war on the Philippines just isn't going to be quite as easy as defending Taiwan, especially when we're just talking about these little reefs and things out in the South China Sea. However, Washington, doesn't need a whole lot from the American people to go to war. Basically, we just can't be rabidly upset about it. And hard to imagine that the American people will be rabidly upset about any war against China. All right, next up here, China hits back at the U.S., Japan, and South Korea after summit. China on Monday hit back against the U.S., South Korea, and Japan after the leaders of the nations accused Beijing of dangerous and aggressive behavior in the South China Sea. The accusation was made in a joint statement issued by Biden, the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida, and the South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol during their summit at Camp David on Friday. The three leaders also called for peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. This is the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Wenbin. They said, the trilateral summit of leaders in the U.S., Japan, and Republic of Korea at Camp David smeared and attacked China on Taiwan and other issues, an act of gross interference in China's internal affairs and a deliberate attempt to sow discord between China and our neighbors, and a serious violations of the norms of international relations. Wang said that Beijing issued formal complaints to the three nations. He noted that the U.S. said the trilateral alliances building with Japan and South Korea is not meant to be aimed at any nation, but U.S. strategy of building up alliances in the region is clearly aimed at Beijing, as U.S. military leaders are open about the fact that they're preparing for war with China. And of course, whenever this happens, I always have to say that, and I think this is a huge flaw with the Biden foreign policy team, and really an unacceptable and elementary misunderstanding of foreign policy that could cause huge problems and a potential war with North Korea. But the U.S. is doing all this military buildup, and it's really concerned about China. However, it's not acknowledging that this military buildup is far more provocative to Pyongyang than Beijing because of the force disparity between the two nations. And so we could end up at a point where we're almost going to war with North Korea, and the American people are going to be shocked and confused that we are at these heightened tensions with North Korea because it hasn't been discussed in the military buildup. From our perspective, is always talked about, well, this is about China. All right. Now on to this article that I wrote for the Institute on August 21st. Human Rights Watch is Saudi policy to murder migrants. Human Rights Watch, HRW, reports that Saudi border forces are systematically murdering migrants attempting to cross into the kingdom from Yemen. The monitoring group said killing refugees had become the official policy of Riyadh. This is a quote from Human Rights Watch. Saudi border guards have killed at least hundreds of Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers who tried to cross the Yemen-Saudi border between March of 2022 and July of 23. If committed as a part of Saudi government policy to murder migrants, these killings, which appear to continue, would be a crime against humanity. The Human Rights Watch report details horrific abuses by Saudi forces, including torture and murder. This again from the report. Saudi border guards have used explosive weapons to kill many migrants and shoot other migrants at close range, including many women and children, in a widespread and systemic pattern of attacks. The report continues. In some instances, Saudi border guards asked migrants which limb to shoot and then shot them at close range. The Human Rights Monitoring Organization says hundreds of migrants, primarily people from Ethiopia, have been killed by Saudi troops attempting to cross the border from Yemen. Saudi Arabia has waged a war in Yemen since 2015 and has committed a multitude of human rights abuses during its military campaign. Those atrocities included killing migrants attempting to flee Riyadh's indiscriminate bombing campaign of its southern neighbor. Human Rights Watch found that those atrocities have been on the rise in the past year. It said, while Human Rights Watch has documented killings of migrants at the border with Yemen and Saudi Arabia since 2014, the killings appear to be a deliberate escalation in both the number and the manner of the targeted killings. The findings from Human Rights Watch is similar to a report released by the MITS Migration Center, MMC, last month. That report found that, quote, a large number of Ethiopian migrants are systematically being killed on the border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia on a daily basis, directly and deliberately by security forces operating under the Saudi Arabian state authority. The targeted nature and the scale of these killings and the fact that the perpetrators are operating under state authority makes this border crossing an exceptionally lethal one. The report could present problems for the Joe Biden White House as Kiev has struggled to make gains on the battlefield. Washington has turned to the Middle East to make a foreign policy accomplishment before the 2024 election. The Biden administration hopes to broker an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Further, as a candidate, Biden pledged to hold Saudi Arabia responsible for crimes the government was committing, including the murder of a Washington Post journalist and the war in Yemen. However, as president, Biden has failed to hold Riyadh to account. M. Johnson explained in an article published on Monday that the U.S. has actually trained and armed the Saudi border forces responsible for committing the crimes against the refugees. An agreement by Riyadh and Tel Aviv would be celebrated as a peace deal in Washington. However, Israel and Saudi Arabia are two of the most repressive governments in the world, and any agreement with the U.S. would involve weapons transfers to both Mideast nations. Any, quote, normalization deal between Tel Aviv and Riyadh would likely lead to Israel increasing its apartheid control over the Palestinians and allow Riyadh to continue its laundry list of war crimes in Yemen. And so, I mean, I think I covered pretty much everything I want to say about this in the article, but it's just so sick. It's so disgusting to just open fire on these migrants when who knows how many of them would even be trying to make it into Saudi Arabia if the Saudis stopped deliberately starving the entire country of Yemen to death, or deliberately bombing the migrant detention facilities in Yemen, killing hundreds of detainees at a time. And I'm sure a lot of those are these Ethiopian migrants too. So it just shows that, the U.S., and particularly under the Biden administration, that this has been maybe more egregious than any other that I could think of. Where, at least with Trump, right, like he called al-Sisi, the Egyptian dictator, his favorite dictator, and Trump was regularly denounced for being too close to autocrats, which at the time the Democrats were using as pro-war propaganda to try to prevent Trump from talking to Putin, Kim, and others. But at least with Trump, when you said things like Trump supports bad governments around the world, people generally believe that was the case. Now, the Biden administration has made it their foreign policy that we support good governments around the world and only good governments and democracy and everything like that, while at the same time making sure that, again, I think probably you could say the two worst governments in the Middle East. And there is a lot to go along with that. I know there's a lot of competition there. And certainly, the UAE and Iran and whatever government is in control of parts of Iraq and Bashar al-Assad and Syria and even others are terrible governments. Erdogan in Turkey. However, Israel has an established apartheid system. Israel is having debates and protests in their streets, and those protests has nothing to do with the apartheid control over the Palestinians, the theft of Palestinian land, the routine murder of innocent Palestinians all over the place, the just taking Palestinians' homes, destroying Palestinians' homes. None of that is at issue in Tel Aviv. All they're upset about is Netanyahu's judicial reforms. In Saudi Arabia, they, if you're concerned about internal repression, look at women, look at gays, look at Shiites, who all, face execution for their, attempting to live a normal life that a Sunni man in Saudi Arabia would be able to live. And then, of course, the war in Yemen is probably the most egregious. And I would tie a lot of, what's happening here at the border in with the war in Yemen, because, these people are walking across the Yemen border, and Saudi Arabia has been killing innocent people in Yemen indiscriminately for 8 years. So why would they care about those walking across the border, especially when the whole time 3 successive U.S. administrations have said we're going to hold Saudi Arabia. I don't know if Trump did, but Biden and Obama, talked about holding Saudis accountable and things like that, and just have continued to fuel this war effort. All right, everybody, that is where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. I'll have another show later this week, and I thank you all so much for tuning in. And should mention, right now at the Institute, we are wrapping up our fundraiser. We have another round of matching funds. So if you head on over, you make a $50 donation today, becomes a $100 donation. You want to make like a $5,000 donation. Help us out. Just let us wrap up this whole fundraiser so I don't have to talk about it again. And we don't do fundraisers that often at the Libertarian Institute. I feel like it's probably been since just like around the beginning of the year that was last, saying, hey guys, at the Institute, we could really use some funds. And in the meantime, I mean, we've produced thousands of articles. I probably written hundreds of news stories myself, put out about 100 shows, 100 of the news roundups, all, just published at the Institute. Not to mention that, these funds go to making sure the Scott Horton show continues. Scott is writing his book Provoked, and so these, funds allow Scott to write that book, and just all kinds of other great stuff at the Institute, what Keaton Knight is doing, what Patrick McFarland is doing, what Connor Freeman is doing, and of course our great writers like Ted Snyder, Ted Galen Carpenter, Sheldon Richmond, James Bovard, Lori Calhoun. So everybody, please head on over to the Institute and help us out, and I will be back with more shows later in the week.